Okay, so welcome everybody to this event, which is the last one in the series of a Grand Challenges seminar series that was organised by students on the doctoral training programme in environmental research here at Oxford. And this series focuses on some of the most significant challenges facing society today. And I just wanted to start by saying that the whole idea for this and the questions really don't come from me as the chair, they come from the students who've organised it. And so just to say thank you and an acknowledgement for all the hard work to Ellen Baker, Paris Jaggers, Mary Reid, Will Langdon, Ben Eagleman and Ed Darby, who put all this together. So this debate is going to discuss the shortcomings of how conservation funding and effort have been prioritised in the past and how perceptions of species value feed into these decisions. And there's some really interesting and knotty philosophical, ethical and conservation questions in there. And so our discussion will try to take a broad range of viewpoints and perspectives and hopefully have a stimulating dialogue. And just want to say, it couldn't be a more topical issue because every day in the press we get more and more stories about biodiversity loss, how to reverse it, how to restore nature, how should governments and society respond to these challenges. And of course, we've had COVID that's focused our attention on our relationships with particular species and how we should improve them. So I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting and a challenging event. So my plan is that we'll have about half an hour of discussion with our excellent panelists. And then there'll be a Q&A session in which the panelists will answer questions that you put to them. And then we'll have just 10 minutes for the panelists to wrap up and give you some final thoughts. And I'm just really excited that the students have managed to tempt in such an exciting lineup of panelists today who've got a great set of expertise and perspectives and backgrounds. So I'm just going to turn to each panelist and ask them just to say a little bit about themselves before we get into the questioning. So maybe we'll start with Claudia, if you'd like to just say a few words about yourself.
Sure. So my name's Claudia. I am the Conservation Science Manager at the Edge of Existence programme based at the Zoological Society of London. So we focus on edge species, which are evolutionarily distinct and globally endangered. So these are species that are really unlike nothing else on the planet. They represent a disproportionate, a really unique amount of our evolutionary history, and they are possibly things that could be lost forever very soon. So that's really the prioritisation approach that we take.
Brilliant. And Marco, would you like to say something now?
Yes, I would like to thank you for asking me to join this panel. It is. I have to admit that this is the very first time that I'm attending an international, webinar or panel or whatever it's called. I've been spending so much time on online Zooming and teaching via Zoom or having meetings that I'm quite tired of this kind of meetings. But anyway, this was a pleasure to join you, and I hope I will learn a thing or two. I'm a sort of quite a regular philosopher. I teach philosophy at the University of Eastern Finland, just a very ordinary courses like ethics and introduction to philosophy and so on. But on the meantime, or perhaps on my spare time, I do research, and mostly I do research on the environment or environmental ethics or environmental philosophy. And biodiversity has haunted me for over 25 years, I think. I started to do research on biodiversity mid-90s. There was also a Finnish research program funded by the Academy of Finland, Finnish biodiversity program that employed me for some years. So I do research on biodiversity on my spare time, but officially I'm a philosophy teacher, if I say so. I don't know or answer to all those questions that we have in front of us, but I do know a thing or two.
Brilliant, thank you. Kartik.
Thanks, EJ, and thanks to all the students who organized this seminar, and thank you for inviting me. I'm Kartik Shankar, and my day job is as faculty at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, where I work with my students on a range of questions in evolutionary ecology and biogeography on taxa ranging from fish, frogs, birds, and marine invertebrates and reef fish. I've also worked on marine turtles for the last 30 plus years since I was an undergraduate. And that's kind of, it's an obsession of a sort. And that led me to an interest in marine conservation. And a group of us formed an NGO called Dakshin Foundation about 12 years ago. And at Dakshin, we work on a range of issues relating to coastal and marine conservation, integrating across the social sciences as well as implementation and interventions in the sectors of education and health and livelihoods and so on. Other than that, I edit a magazine that combines, that brings art and science together called Current Conservation. And most fun of all for me, I write children's novels once in a while. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. And Tony? You're muted.
You see, I told you about that, didn't I? As soon as I switched that off, I'd never switch it on again. Thank you, EJ, for having me here, and good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Tony Juniper. I describe myself as an environmentalist. I've been working in the field of conservation, sustainability, environment for 36 years or something like that now. And today I am the chairman of the British government's Nature Conservation Agency in England, Natural England. We have a very wide-ranging remit, working on behalf of the country and government to advance all of these agendas. I'm also a fellow with the University of Cambridge Sustainability Leadership Institute. I've had quite a varied career working with quite a few different organisations over the years, the Wildlife Trusts, Friends of the Earth. I was there for a long time. I've worked with WWF, with BirdLife International, with FFI. A lot of my career has been in campaigning and advocacy and writing and running organisations. And yes, it's remarkable actually how infrequently we are invited to engage with these more philosophical dimensions of the work. And so a welcome discussion to have as we approach, what is hopefully a new era for conservation as the world finally starts to wake up to what's going on, and it does seem to be doing. So that's very exciting, and good to inform that excitement with some depth of thinking.
Brilliant. Well, maybe you can just start by answering this first question, particularly as you must get this a lot from government. So what is it that we as conservationists actually want? So what do we want to prioritise or maximise? Well,
it depends who you ask, EJ. So, but if you're asking me, I think what we want is a harmonious accommodation between the world of people and the biosphere. Because for too long, we have assumed that the human world exists in a parallel state to the rest of nature. And as a result of that, we have degraded and destroyed nature to the point today where we are at a crisis. And one of the reasons why that crisis has emerged is because until recently, I think it was assumed that the degradation of nature wasn't really going to bother us too much. And it looks like conservation was really a special interest group of people concerned about lions and tigers and birds and trees. And, that was all very well. And those things were quite pretty. And they were, things that ideally we'd hang on to, but it wasn't seen as essential. But we're entering a period now where it is becoming seen as essential. And as we navigate that new space where we can see that the future of humankind depends on the future for nature, we need to be thinking about what the outcome looks like. And for me, it is that. It's the recovery of the natural world at the same time as meeting the needs of 9.5, 10 billion people. And so, that's the really broad kind of context for it in terms of where I try to drive the discussion and hopefully lead to some positive progress. And behind that, of course, then you get into the much more familiar territory about how we do that. And so yes, we do area-based conservation. We identified those spaces where nature is still strong, and where there's uniqueness and threatened species and endangered ecosystems, and we try and conserve those. And then we look at some of the cross-cutting agendas of transport and agriculture and urbanization, and we try and build conservation into those policies. So that's a kind of a parallel track. And then of course there is the species track, which probably is where I guess we began on this journey about 100 years ago, when people started to get concerned about disappearing animals and plants, and they focused on those to begin with. And all three of those things, they're now blended together. They're all interrelated. The work geared towards the conservation of individual animals and plants that are disappearing, the area-based work, and then the cross-cutting work. And there's a new piece now, actually, which I've been particularly excited about, and it's only really been there for this last 10 years, and that is about aligning economics with ecology. And this is quite a new area, but it's beginning to gain some traction. It's quite controversial. So some people really take against the idea of natural capital, which is how some of this stuff is manifest. But I think, if we are in the end going to be able to conserve the biosphere, it's going to have to be through the way we do economics, because that's the main problem. We grow our economy by shrinking nature. That's what we've been doing for millennia, and we can't carry on doing that anymore, and we've got to shift it. And so, those domains of conservation, of area-based work, of agricultural policy and transport policy and the species stuff, we need to be pushing it more into that economic space, I would say. I'm not sure I'm making a lot of sense now. I better stop there before I go off on another tangent. So anyway, there's a few opening thoughts, EJ.
Brilliant. Yeah, and maybe I'll turn to Claudia now, because your work is very much species-based. So when you're trying to prioritize or maximize something, what is it you're trying to maximize?
So specifically for our program, we're very much looking at prioritizing the species that represent the largest amount of threatened evolutionary history. So we take a tree of life, a phylogeny, and from that we calculate essentially a measure of how many millions of years of evolutionary history could be lost if that species goes extinct. So we're combining that phylogenetic information with the IUCN Red List, which gives us our measure of threat for each of those species. So yeah, very specifically for our program, we calculate those metrics, but the rationale and the idea is very much that is compatible with other ways, and many of the things that Tony just mentioned, in order to build together a picture of what is desired for any particular conservation program or particular landscape, or the scores that we create have been used, for example, by policymakers to fit one piece into the puzzle of saying, well, we do want this information on the ecosystem services, for example, we want this information on what the charismatic value is of the species in a particular area, and then we want this extra piece that's about the evolutionary history and what's the kind of extraordinary, unique quality of the biodiversity that's in any particular location, and that's where the EDGE program fits in, where EDGE species fits in.
So Kartik, what do you think about when you're trying to maximize or prioritize?
So I, on the one hand, there are many things that both Tony and Claudia said that I completely agree with. I think the challenge that one encounters in places not just like India, but in Africa and the global South, is that while at an intellectual level and at an academic level, many of those arguments make perfect sense. The consequences through sort of the pipelines of politics and society have negative consequences for particular sections of society. So area-based conservation around the world, as valuable as that has been, there's been communities that have borne disproportionate cost. There are movements today, for example, that aim to sort of protect. There's the Nature Needs Half and Half Earth movements, which all of which sound sort of very, noble in principle, but one doesn't hear of any plans to rewild London or New York. Really, it's people in the global South that are actually going to be giving up their land in some form or the other. I mean, when these plans are laid out, it all sounds very beautiful, but as we've seen in 100 years of conservation history, there's marginalized communities around the world that are bearing these costs. So for me, in a sense, prioritization itself is an exercise that needs to be carried out in an inclusive manner. So I take the stand that I refuse to prioritize as a scientist. That for me, a prioritization exercise has, by default or by construct, it has to include the people that I work with, and we need that broader, inclusive approach to conservation, where every step of that decision making, even the step of what we value, is sort of an inclusive, pluralistic, decision. And I just wanted to make one point to, a little aside to Tony. One of the advantages of working on turtles is that you've always got a story that's a little older than everybody else's. And so one of the first conservation laws is a law in Bermuda that was protecting sea turtles in 1620. The Bermuda Assembly passed a law against the killing of our young tortoises. So in the Western world, it's about 400 years, and in India, there's edicts going back 2,000 years on conservation. So, but that's just an aside. Thanks, EJ.
Okay, so from the philosophical side, Marco, what's the view on this question?
Okay, thanks. I think I agree with Kartik that it's quite important to have the people included in decision making about these conservation programs and policies. That's important, and that was something that I was planning to emphasize in my prepared prepared talk, not proper talk, but my script that I've been writing down, or some of my thoughts I've been writing down. And I'm happy that Tony mentioned that in the UK, or was it in England, Meli, that also there are some philosophical discussions being involved in this conservation biology and conservation policies, because in Finland there is nothing. So I'm totally independent. Nobody has asked me any opinion from the Ministry of the Environment or anything like that. So I don't. That's why I don't know so much about these trends and what is happening there in the ministry. But I know at the right now they are renewing the Finnish nature protection legislation, and they've been consulting with some other people, but not philosophers. But thinking about the philosophy, what is the importance or the purpose of philosophy here? That I think that quite many philosophers are interested in having a big visions. What is the proper relationship between humanity and the natural world, including biodiversity? I think I'm a little bit more humble in my attempts, that I haven't yet developed that kind of big vision. Not yet. I guess most of the work that I've done with the biodiversity has to do with the concept of biodiversity. Is it needed? What should be included in biodiversity? So the biodiversity itself is important. How we define it, because there are also in the conservation biology community there are some division of opinion. Some people are not that eager to include those varieties that are human dependent, and others are more open to have them too. I don't know whether these kind of discussions are they being debated in the UK or elsewhere, but I think that has been at least at the center when this kind of philosophical discussion started on biodiversity. Also, there has been a discussion whether the biodiversity is a good concept in itself. Some people are opposing it, and they have suggested something, alternatives. But I am a little bit skeptical about that. I don't know. Biodiversity is a nice concept, and it translates into other languages, many languages, quite easily, and it's quite established. So what alternatives there has been, I think that they has not been that good. At least in some debates in English language philosophy, the alternatives, they don't translate, for example, into my language, my mother tongue, into Finnish. There has been some very awkward or strange proposals by some philosophers. So perhaps this is what I have got to say here.
So that's a perfect segue into the next kind of topic, which is when many people think about biodiversity, what they actually think about is tigers, pandas, maybe turtles even. What they don't think about is solenodons and fungi. And in fact, we have lists of the names of the mammals, and then we just have fungi or plants, which is some enormous group. And so what is the benefit of having this focus on the cuddly, the charismatic, the big, the hairy, the things like us? And what is the cost? And maybe we'll start with Kartik as a turtle person and then go on to Claudia.
Thanks, EJ. I'm a bit of I'm a flagship fan and a flagship heretic. I've often sort of ended my talks by saying, if the devil came up to me and offered me a choice between my precious sea turtles and a healthy marine ecosystem, and said, would you give up all your turtle species for that? My answer would be yes. And if I polled my sea turtle colleagues around the world, my guess is that 80% would actually say no to that. And that, in some sense, that reflects the problem. Flagships are just wonderful ways of getting people engaged with nature, with the natural world. That's about how 50% of us became ecologists, because we got obsessed with one species or another. But then when you're unable to let go of that obsession, and I'm obsessed. I mean, I'm happy to admit it. So I'm recovering, sea turtle biologist, if one might. We should have a help group for us. But as conservationists, as people interested in environmental sustainability as a whole, I think we need to be able to let go of those things that tie us emotionally, to be able to individual species, to be able to connect with the bigger picture. I'm going to say they're incredibly valuable at one level, and I say that from personal experience, but I think they're also incredibly costly. And we wrote about how sea turtles had done more harm than good as conservation icons in India, and we said, to take that metaphor of the flagship forward, we said, are they flagships or gunboats? And in fact, paper more recently used a similar sort of metaphor and compared not just turtles but other species, but said, are they flagships or battleships? And so I leave you with that, which is that sometimes they truly are what they were intended to be, and sometimes they actually have that perverse consequence of having the opposite effect of what we intended.
Yeah.
Claudia.
Yeah. Yes. Some really interesting comments there. I agree with a lot of that. I think, especially there can be really powerful flagships, and having this kind of charismatic species is something we kind of, I guess, tread the line kind of carefully with in Edge, because we are very much trying to bring attention to overlooked species that are really weird and wonderful and wacky. I mean, like, people in general might have heard of the duck-billed platypus. They've very rarely heard of the echidna, and the strange things it does. But even for our program, like we've put together lists for mammal species, for birds, for amphibians, more recently for reptiles. We do have a list for corals, but the data behind a lot of the corals is much harder to get high-quality data for, and beyond like tetrapods, it's been really, really hard to establish ways to prioritize unique and weird and wonderful species. So there have been master students working this year, for example, on crayfish, and we've had like the first work that's been done on on bony fish, but that's kind of exciting new ground. We haven't got anything yet for like insects, and these are species that are incredibly ecologically important, that are really not as charismatic as some of the other. People have been like, oh my goodness, how are you going to raise funds to do the conservation for crayfish? But like, there are some big crayfish enthusiasts out there, luckily. And so yeah, it's very important that people do care a lot about the flagship species that people get involved, that we do have good data for mammals. For example, we've been able to try a lot of refining our metrics with the mammal data because it's very good. But in the end, there's a huge amount of biodiversity, and our goal to kind of conserve the whole tree of life is going to be really difficult if we don't have more interest and more research and more work being done on those other groups as well.
Tony.
Yeah. So I'm just sitting here reflecting, and thank you for those comments, Kartik and Claudia. Really interesting. And I'm just reflecting on something that was said earlier about conservation being about people. And it obviously is, because if it wasn't for the people, then we wouldn't have to have conservation. It's only because of the people. The animals and plants will be fine. It is in the end about how we connect to people who make decisions that hopefully can be made better in the future. And really important to remember that nearly all of the people who are going to make those decisions, they're not us. And so it's about connecting with people who are not ecologists and being able to inspire them to want to do things differently. And so to that extent, some of these flagships that connect with people, they are pretty vital. I was just sitting here a second ago thinking about what WWF might have achieved if its logo was some kind of mushroom or a micro moth with only a Latin name rather than a panda, and whether they would have got as far in shaping the global agenda. And of course, the answer is probably they wouldn't have got very far at all, or certainly, not to the extent they have. And so selecting the flagships to do that bigger thing for us, whether it's, describing the conservation mission generally, or something which is a little bit more specific, like, for example, the tiger in India. There's been some really good work done during recent years with protecting and reconnecting pieces of forest. And I wonder how much of that would have done had the tiger not been the ambassador for that work. And so I think, conservation, it does need those symbols and those ambassador species to be able to connect and to be able to say something more broadly. But I think Claudia just put her finger on something which is much more challenging. And that's when the flagship has to be the thing itself. So if you're focusing on crayfish, then you can't really, well, I suppose you could try, but you can't necessarily use a tiger or a panda to make the case for the crayfish. And so the crayfish has to be its own flagship, as it were. And similarly with those micro moths and those rare fungi, that, for any rational ecological point of view, they're of equal importance. And in fact, you might say of more importance. The fungi and the plankton, probably we couldn't live as a global civilization without those, whereas probably with the tiger we could, but the fungi and the plankton get no airtime whatsoever. So this is quite a conundrum, but one that people have we've benefited from it. We've benefited from it. The money that's been raised and the public engagement that's been achieved, and some of the work on the ground, it has been done via these flagships. But they're not the whole story, especially when you get down to the kinds of edge species, that they don't have common names, or they're not very familiar, and it becomes a much more challenging place. I tell you what, Claudia, very interesting piece of work there for some researchers to look at the communications issues there, and how you actually do cut through that with a wider public. I wouldn't know where to begin personally, but there's certainly some interesting work to be done.
Okay, so Marco, we'll just get your thoughts on this, and then we'll move to some questions from the floor, because lots of really good questions are coming in.
Okay, thank you. I think I mostly agree with the other speakers or other panelists on most things, but I think I have something to add here too, because I'm not a biologist or ecologist or a scientist at all. And when I'm reading, for example, ecological text, it can be quite, incomprehensible, inaccessible, very abstract. So it is quite easy to communicate with species that there is something, well, worrying happening in nature, that we should take a notice, and we should also revise our policies and react to it as a society. So I think that with species or flagship species, it's easy to communicate, make visible the changes in nature. And also with species, we can, or flagship species, we can make, we can visualize whether our policies has been successful or failures, because the populations, they vary, and the population variation may depend on our policies. And also with but in some cases, also quite, well, ordinary species can be important. And I think that these population changes with ordinary species like sparrow, they tell something about the environmental change. So I think that they also they're kind of medium to the general public, that we should also worry about, for example, the changes in the environment or the climate change. So I guess here we come to also to the climate change and environmental change, with how we what we tell about these changes in biodiversity and population changes. So this is.
Yeah, thank you. So I've got a couple of questions which are following on from Claudia's point about how do you go about prioritizing when you don't have data. So there's one exactly that from Avika. How do you even start to prioritize when you don't have data? And the follow on from that is interesting, which says, because there's so little data in the global south, how can we make sure that we prioritize properly for the global south rather than for species and for areas when we do have lots of good data? So Claudia, would you like to reflect on that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess first, how do we do the prioritizing when we don't have enough data? I mean, there has to be a base level of data in order to even start. So there are groups that we just cannot work with yet. But then for those where there is enough to at least start to put together a picture. So for example, there might be a lot of species missing from a phylogeny. If there's a few thousand species and there's like several hundred missing, it is possible to insert those species into the most likely position, and then create a range of possibilities that for the list, for the prioritization list. So there's kind of a process of capturing that uncertainty around where do these species actually fit. So we've got some information about where they could be, we don't know for sure, and we can work with that. Likewise, when the red list data isn't necessarily so if we have data deficient species where we know a little bit about them, but we don't really know how threatened they are, we are trying to devise ways to, again, kind of insert those in a way that captures the uncertainty around where they could lie. Because certainly for those data deficient species, it could very likely be the reason we find it hard to do research on them is because there's very few of them left, and they might be really extraordinary, and we want to try and engage with them in some way before we lose them forever. So we are trying to work very hard on ways to at least make a start, even when we don't have data.
Yeah.
I guess with the Global South, I just would add really quickly that we do, within our program, prioritize and work specifically with local conservationists. So we call them Edge Fellows, and we fund them to work in Latin America and Africa and Asia in order to try and get data on edge species from exactly the places where it's lacking.
Yeah. So now I've got one which I think Kartik would be a good person to ask. Coming back to your point about the choice between turtles and the sea. So should we try to save everything? And if not, Jessica suggests, how do we transition from valuing flagships to ecosystems?
Well, I think that that's the question that I ask all the time. I think the transition is really important, and I want to, go back to the point that Tony made about tigers, and I do agree that tigers played an important role in the history of conservation in India, but there's certainly a school of thought that believes that in the last 2 decades, tigers have done more damage for conservation in India than good. And this is sort of really by becoming an attractor for a particular approach. I'm not sure what the answer to that really is. I suspect that it has to do with some level of introspection within the conservation community to begin with, because I think that the messages that we're sending out are quite mixed. As I said, you can poll a bunch of turtle biologists or tiger biologists, and 90% of them will still pick their species over the ecosystem. And that just makes no sense to me at all, because if you think of it from the view of either anthropocentric conservation of values to us, or if you think of it, and I'm not a biocentrist in any sense of the word, but even if you were to do that, if you were to look at ecosystems as a whole and ecosystem function, to me the answer is you always choose the ecosystem over any individual species. But when we're not doing it ourselves as a conservation community, how on earth are we actually expecting the wider public or people getting into the field to do that? So my answer, in a sense, is that this is really something for the conservation community to introspect on first, and when we're able to sort of sort ourselves out, I think we'll be able to convey those messages more effectively to the to the rest of the world.
Yeah. Does anyone have anything to add on that? Then we'll move on to Tony. Oh, yeah, go on.
So it's good to sort of reflect on Kartik's point there about the messages that are coming from the conservation community. I mean, we're operating at so many levels simultaneously. It's hardly surprising that there are so many things coming across to people all at once. So there's this question, do we save this species or that species? There's the ecosystem and the habitat side of life. There's these different contexts from different parts of the world, and different voices coming with different perspectives, private sector versus campaign groups, and they're all giving a particular view on these subjects, and it's utterly incoherent, really. I mean, even to us, never mind anybody who's not versed in all of this and understanding the nuance. And how we cut through that, I don't know. I guess in the end, if there is one thing that sits across all of this, and how you'd articulate it and express it is a big question. But it is about the relationship between the natural world and the human world. And even then you get into discussions, well, some people would say, well, humans are nature. And so making a distinction there is straight away a false distinction, because if we make that distinction, we're reinforcing the problem, because, we're as embedded in the natural world as bumblebees and birds. And, if we don't say that, then we're kind of misrepresenting reality. So this is really a big question, actually, and it's a really important one, and I don't know what the answer is either. Maybe some of the people listening do.
Maybe. So just to kind of press a little bit harder. So Marco, do you think that we should be trying to save every species? Is there a philosophical reason why we should be doing that?
Well, I'm sorry, I will disappoint you. I don't know the answer to this question, because every time that I've been thinking about this issue, smallpox virus come to my mind, or some nasty bacteria. Well, I don't know. I don't know the answer, and so I guess we have to decide. Oh, what even if I had an answer, it doesn't matter, because I'm just one person, and the Russians and the Americans, they have in their archives, they have the smallpox virus, and these are also matters of highly political matters related to biosecurity and so on, and perhaps even warfaring. So of course these are exceptional cases, but when you think about those species that are in some sense innocent, I don't see any reason why shouldn't we try to save what we can. At least we should do our best. But of course there are those nasty species that are quite different, and usually in these discussions we take it's a kind of Nazi card you have, that you always, when you think about this question, one may always say that, well, these are these nasty animals that, or nasty bacteria and nasty virus that nobody wants to have, but they might be quite exceptional cases after all, just minor cases. I'm not sure about this, but this is what I think.
EJ, was the question, should we save everything? Was that how it was phrased? Well,
this is a question from back from the brink. The ethics of conservation are very interesting. We ultimately decide what we save. The irony being that human impact got to our point. With that in mind, should we try to save everything? Yeah, well, there we are. It's a bit like a First World War field hospital, isn't it? You've got 2 or 3 doctors covered in blood, and there's thousands of casualties being brought in different states of, like, injury. And 50% of them are going to die. And do you spend your time working on those, or the ones you can save? I mean, that is the reality of the situation we're in at the moment, up to a point at least. You can see that some things, they've declined so far, and they are looking like it's irretrievable because the pressures are so big, and yet there are some things that could be saved, and everybody who's working in this field has only got so much budget. And so, irrespective of the ethical answer, the practical one, I think, tells us that we have to focus on what we can save, I would say. And how would you know what you can save?
Well, there we are. And that's when we get into how much data have we got, how much do we know? And then we're making judgments about the future, because we don't know what the future will hold. And so one experience for me is the Spix's macaw back in 1990. I was with a field of some biologists in the field in Brazil, and we discovered the world population was 1 bird. And so, there's 13 in captivity, we think. And, you look at that and you think that looks utterly hopeless. And we sat around the boardroom table at BirdLife International and we said, are we going to bother with this? Or are we just going to say now, actually, there's no point in putting resources into this? And we as ever, we kind of made a compromise. Well, we'll keep an eye on it and we'll do what we can. And, but we won't put a massive effort behind it. And actually now, this is 30 years later now, and there's about 130 in captivity, and there's a field station that's preparing for the release back into the wild quite soon. I don't know if that would qualify as an edge species, Claudia. It's a monotypic genus anyway, so it might do. But back then it was irrespective of it being a monotypic genus, it looked like it was about to disappear, and so we kind of edged back. We kind of stepped back a bit. And in hindsight, looking at it now, it probably is savable. I mean, there's inbreeding issues and various other things, but we didn't know what the future would hold, and we didn't know that people, would start to cooperate and would start to, pull things around. It's incredibly difficult, and that one we just happened to have some information about it because we'd been into the field to look, and had we not gone, we wouldn't have even known that. It would have possibly disappeared without even anyone noticing, possibly. Yeah.
So here's one from Juliet Maxted, which I think is perfect for you, Claudia. So have you noticed where the shifting media representation of particular species or issues changes the interest or funding for those particular things? So hopefully, because you're trying to shift media interest for particular species, you've noticed some change.
Yeah, the short answer to that is yes. I mean, the example that springs to mind is the punk turtle release that we kind of shone a spotlight on it when we released the first Edge reptiles list. And as I imagine Kartik might appreciate, there were a lot of reptiles on that list that weren't really getting enough attention and still aren't, to be honest. But the punk turtle is a particularly captivating photograph of it because it can breathe through its bum. It has the cloaca, the organ through which it defecates. It also has the gills, so it genuinely can breathe through its bottom. Wow. And it therefore can stay underwater for quite long periods of time. It grows a lot of algae all over its body, and this particular individual had a really great green Mohican, and was hence given the name the punk turtle. And as a result of kind of going viral, the local pressure within the species in Australia to protect its habitat, there was a lot of focus on what was being done there, and there was increased fundraising to support the work to conserve that species as a result of media attention. Yeah. And we do try and and use edge species like that, which are particularly notable in terms of their ecology or the way that they look to garner to gather support for the rest. But yeah, the short answer is yes.
Yes. So maybe this one's for you, Kartik. This is from Ian. How important or relevant is conservation genomics for our decision making, or for understanding or getting better data?
You promise not to tell my donors what my answer to this question is. So I'm in the odd position of being professionally an evolutionary ecologist and biogeographer, and I spend a lot of my time doing, building trees and building phylogenies, raising money for, my earliest work was funded as conservation genetics. My first, postdoctoral papers were published on, how molecular phylogeography informs conservation of turtles and so on. Having worked in the field for 20 years in conservation, I find that in complex scenarios, complex political, social, cultural situations, which is about 80% of the world, 90% of the information that we generate as conservation science is pretty useless. What we need to know to bring about change on the ground is really largely from the social universe. I'm not even going to say the social sciences. I mean, the social sciences have an enormous amount to contribute, far more, I think, than ecology. But even so, it's not even the PhDs in social sciences. It's really social knowledge. And political knowledge and knowledge of how to bring about change on the ground, which is not academic at all. So like I said, don't go tell my donors, but I love what I do in my academic life, and but I've grown to realize, or my sense from my experience is that that by itself doesn't make a whole lot of difference on the ground.
So here's one that is perfect for Tony, and it kind of links a question that the student panel wanted us to put, and one from Rosaria, which is, what is the point of having a prioritization agenda as a conservationist when scientists don't make these decisions anyway? Politicians make these decisions, and how can you kind of engage politicians and make sure that your prioritization is robust to the vagaries of politics? So I think that's one perfect for Tony.
Yeah, so, well, politicians are one decision-making group. They're not alone. There are lots of NGOs that are making decisions, and, in many cases and in some geographies, they've got more resources and impact than the governments themselves. So, it's important to, highlight that great breadth of entities out there, including landowners. There's people in this country who've decided, they own big areas of land, and they've decided they really like curlews. And so they're managing their land to, control predators, create habitat in order to stop that bird disappearing. And I think most people agree that that is, a really important priority to keep that bird going. But that's not the government, that's individuals, and, the NGOs, again, a separate group of entities. When it comes to the politicians, it's a combination of science and law, inevitably, where this finishes up. So, are they convinced by the science? And generally, they will be amenable to that, notwithstanding sometimes, tensions around particular interests who may or may not wish to see something conserved that is, causing a conflict or damage or whatever. But then converting that science into legislation is the next step. And, once you've done that, we do have quite a lot of that in the UK. And that science policy interface has been influenced by NGOs and others. And you can see that influence in the annexes of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, in the annexes of the Habitats Directive, and, various other bits of legislation that set out the political calculus that has turned the science into legislation, and then linked to those species and that prioritization, which is set out in those annexes are the rules that conserve those animals and plants. And, you know, politics is, you know, it's about balancing interests. And the interests are many. But, you know, if you want to really kind of boil it down to the basics, it's the interests of the economy and ecology and where they meet, and the extent to which politicians are prepared to place some kind of limit or restriction or obligation on various economic interests in order to be able to reflect the science that's been passed to them by different interest groups, including us actually as the official advisors. And so, you know, the fine balancing act for the politicians, you see it at every turn, with various measures put in to be able to manage those conflicts at a finer level of detail where necessary. And you know, and that's where you get an awful lot of controversy when the politics is forced to make a decision in those difficult spaces. You know, really big arguments going on, and you know that you can see them in different places. One right now is the protection of the badger, which is protected under legislation in this country, but there are legal routes to managing badgers in order to be able to protect certain economic interests. And so the badgers are being culled in England at the moment in order to protect the economic interests of dairy and beef farming. And that's a political choice. And, you know, it's extremely difficult for everybody concerned. But that's what politics is. It's about balancing those interests, recognizing that the science, you know, it's kind of the base level. That's the information, you know, that you take, and then you've got principles behind that, and then you turn that into law, and then that law inevitably has a lot of nuance about how it's implemented. Yeah, good question. And that's where I spend my days of the week.
So just to kind of finish off, we've got a couple of questions that I'm going to ask to all the panelists. I'm going to start with Markku. And Markku, if there's one thing that you'd like people to take away from this discussion today, what's that one thing?
I've got one as well. Where's mine?
Okay, this was the trickiest question that you gave me now, because I was thinking the previous one that about the relationship between the expert judgment and the politicians. Perhaps I would continue on that. That could be my takeaway message as well, because first of all, I think that there are, besides the experts or scientists and politicians, there are also public officials, and there are courtrooms, there are lawyers, there are legal cases. They all affect how the policies, conservation policies are being made, what they are really like. And I think that especially the power the public officials in my country have in these decisions, it's quite important. Because most politicians are not even interested in about these conservation prioritization issues. I think they are just too trivial to them. But when it comes to the expert judgment, there is a kind of political model that most people dislike, and this political model is depicted and promoted by Plato in his book The State. So there are people who know better, and they are the philosophers in Plato's case, but in our world, it's the experts. And I don't know whether it's a good thing that those who know better make the decisions. We can think about, for example, this COVID-19 situation in Sweden. They have an expert who make decision about these COVID policies, Anders Tegnell. And the situation there is terrible compared to other Nordic countries, whereas the politicians have also had their things to say and formulate the policies, how to respond to COVID situation. But I know that in some other countries where are no experts being listened to, well, the situation can be quite bad as well. So I think that experts and expert judgment and expert opinion has its place in general discussion, but it should not be overrated or underrated. So perhaps this is my take-home message.
Thank you. And Claudia, what's your take-home?
I guess I couldn't kind of two things I wanted to say, one of which is kind of reflects a little bit on the like, can we save everything? And that is, I guess, through choosing to do prioritization, we are recognizing that we cannot save everything. And that kind of triage process that Tony was also talking about, that, you know, I have to kind of put in a bit of a plug for the edge species, and that I think there are some truly wacky and unusual things, like from the sharks list, there's a ray that is named after a hoover because of the way it eats. And in terms of engaging with politicians and getting a lot of support for conservation action, finding those unusual stories, finding those really things that capture the imagination and really help audiences to engage with them, will stop species being left behind. And I think essential alongside that is also to focus on having a really diverse community within the conservation sector, and making sure there aren't kind of promising future leaders or future conservationists that are left behind either.
Great, thank you. Tony, what's your...
Yeah, so take away from this conversation. So I guess in some ways we've kind of taken the theme of prioritization, and, you know, why do we take certain choices in terms of where we put the effort? And then we've kind of gone into the importance of people and what people think about this, and then what they do about it, and then politics and how that's manifest in decisions that are taken by governments and others. And so, you know, if this is all about people and politics, then I think it's about engagement and engaging those communities of, you know, the public on one side and the decision makers on the other, and just getting them to understand some of this stuff, really. And, you know, that's then about communications. And, you know, one of the things I've noticed over the years is that we conservationists have an enormous capacity and propensity to know more and more about our subject matter, and to make it more and more complicated as we go along. And sometimes not to recognize that there are people who don't even know the basics. And so, you know, I think my takeaway is, let's focus on communicating the basics to, you know, the key people who are going to decide this. And that's the voters and the politicians, really, in the end, I think, you know, to put it very crudely. And so, you know, that's then about, you know, how we reach out. You know, it's no accident that Sir David Attenborough emerges as a great hero in all of this, because he's probably been more successful than anybody in sharing this message and this kind of conversation with billions of people, literally. And so, you know, we all have to be focused on that, I think, as much as the stuff that's our, you know, day-to-day, you know, more technical and more in kind of, you know, in the detail work, and being able to share that big vision with many more people. I think that's what it is. And there's lots of ways of doing that.
Yeah, thank you. And Kartik?
Thanks. I think, you know, one way of looking at it is, you know, and everybody's touched upon this, that, you know, we're engaging with, on the one hand, there are mechanisms through the market, and through the state, and through civil society, and these are sort of the three pillars through which change comes about in our world. And each of these has their role, and Marcus spoke a fair bit about the state already, but, you know, I'd like to focus on you know, how we can bring about that change through society, because at the end of the day, unless we connect to other sectors across society, such as, you know, I don't believe we can achieve conservation, for example, without vibrant democracy. I don't believe we can actually achieve it without, you know, cultural inclusiveness. I don't believe we can, you know, achieve it without, you know, openness of thought and acceptance and tolerance. So for me, conservation is you know, cannot be isolated from all of these you know, other things. And I think as conservationists as well, our engagements need to be broad enough to encompass society and nature. And I can't repeat the quote from memory, but there's something from Arthur Conan Doyle. I think it's a study in Scarlet, where Holmes says, your ideas have to be as broad as nature in order to understand it. And if I might sort of modify that, our ideas have to be as broad as nature and society if we are to sort of preserve them both.
Great. So I'm going to finish off with a quick fire, and I'm going to put you all on the spot, and you just have to say, what species would you save if you were on a desert island this kind of situation? You have to save one species from the waves. What would it be, Claudia?
I always get asked this. It's really difficult. I actually change species every time to spread the love a bit. Today I'm going to go with the hooded grebe, I think, which is a really extraordinary bird from Argentina, there's a truly exceptional conservation project working to save it, and they've done great work removing invasive species, but they're battling in the face of climate change. And today I would give them a bit of a help with that.
Hooded grebe it is. Marco?
Well, I don't. My biology friend and collaborator Timo Vuorisaha told me that every biologist has his or her favorite animal. But I have to say that I don't have mine. So for some reasons, well, animals are also individuals that one should remember, and also many plants are interesting, and trees can be interesting. In my neighborhood, there are some very nice trees that I admire a lot, and they are quite old trees. So I like them. Perhaps a tree.
Species covers anything, not just animals, and the trees. Good. We'll trees in your back garden.
I'm going to make some of my students and not others very happy by saying racket-tailed drongos. Just simply the most intelligent birds that I've ever come across. And famously, one of a PhD student who was working on drongos, her field assistant told her, he said, while you're doing your PhD on all of these other birds, the drongo's doing its PhD on you. So that's got to be, and it's a protagonist in my children's story. So one of my favorites.
Okay, Tony, what's yours?
Well, I think I'd have to go back to the Spix's macaw, given that history over those years. And yeah, maybe it's in a slightly better position than it was 30 years ago. So I'll stick with that one.
Brilliant. Okay, so we've come to our end, and I hope you've all had an interesting discussion, and the audience out there have enjoyed it. And I just want to say a big round of thanks for our 4 excellent panelists who've given up their time to have this really interesting discussion, very late at night for some of them. So thank you so much to the panel. Also, thank you to the audience. I've been receiving your questions. It's clear that you've been really engaged and asked some really interesting stuff. And I finally want to ask the PhD students who organised this to put their cameras on so that we can all thank them for organising it. So guys, can we see you?
Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you very much. And with that, I think we can close it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, DJ. Everyone, lovely to see you all. Great discussion. Bye-bye.
Thank you.